Welcome to episode 2 in our 4-part webinar series on the Australian live cattle export trade. In episode 1 we covered a beef industry overview and looked at the summary of the last 3 decades in terms of live cattle trade volumes and live cattle trade value, and we finished that webinar with an analysis of the relationship between domestic slaughter and the live cattle export trade. So in this webinar we're going to take a look at the hotspots around the country for live cattle exports, both in terms of a state measure and a breakdown of areas within the states. And we'll also take a look at the value chain of the live cattle trade across the country and the reliance of some of the northern participants in the value chain in terms of how much of their revenues are attributable to live cattle exports. So if we have a look at the export hotspots to begin with, and the chart on the left hand side just shows the state breakdown of point of origin for live cattle in a proportionate measure, and it's been broken down into 5-year periods beginning in 97 and ending in 2017. So if we look at the bottom bar there, the 97 to 2002 period, we can see that 63% of the Northern Territory, 63% of live export cattle originated from the Northern Territory, as opposed to 24% of live cattle from WA and 10% of the live cattle coming out of Queensland. So it's important to note that these figures are not the exit ports, but where the cattle originated from. So you can have a scenario where cattle may have originated in Queensland but exited out of Darwin, say. So we can see through time, as we go through the 5-year periods, the readjustment of those proportions, and particularly the Queensland levels. So the cattle originating in Queensland that were destined for live cattle trade has reduced from 10% through to 6% over that time, and the proportion of live cattle originating out of WA has increased from 24% to 41%, and the Northern Territory has slightly reduced down to 53% from 63%. So that by 2012, 2017, that's the current scenario of where live cattle are originating from across the country for the last 5 years. And for those that have seen webinar 1, those proportions in the 2012 to 2017 period, they're the same proportions that reflected in the beef industry analysis flow chart that showed where those cattle were coming from across the states. The same numbers are used there that reflect that flow diagram. So we'll take a look now and see the breakdown within these state regions, and the chart on the right is an animation that I'm going to start in a minute, starting in 1996 and going through to 2016, but it's going to show the amount of cattle sold within that region as a proportion of total cattle sales. So you'll be able to see the darker areas within the states are the real hotspots for the live cattle trade. So we'll just get that running now from 96 through, and you can see the dominance of those northern sectors, northern parts of Northern Territory and the northern part of WA, highly reliant upon that live cattle trade. And when we finish now in 2016, we can see that the very far north of the Northern Territory at 100%, so pretty much all of their cattle destined for live cattle, and then below that around 87%, going down to around 42% within the middle part of the Northern Territory of cattle there destined for live trade. And the big part of the Pilbara there in WA, 75% of cattle in that region destined for live export markets. And when you contrast that to the Queensland scenario, you can see that through central Queensland around the 17% mark, Capricornia around the 17% mark, and up into the very northern tropics there, the tip of Queensland, around 20% of their cattle destined for live cattle trade there. So very much a northern West Australian and northern Territory dominated industry, and that's largely facilitated by the fact that there's limited processing facilities within that region and also limited access to feedlots within the Northern Territory and Northern WA. And this combines with the geographic isolation and adding to freight costs and the distances needed to cover to access southeastern markets or facilities, along with the crossing of tick zones and biosecurity factors that really mean that those regions, by their location, are very much have to be focused towards the live cattle export trade as a viable option for them to offload their livestock. So if we move across to the value chain, now what we're looking at here is data collected from 2005 to 2009. Now the percentage value chain, which is the orange or brown part of the chart on the left, that represents a aggregation of value chains across the country. So it's including 4 northern beef value chains, 1 southern beef value chain, and 2 dairy live export value chains. So it gives you a bit of an idea as to the proportionate part of the value chain that each of those participants take of the overall slice. And it's fairly clearly represented that producers take the lion's share, around 60% or so of the value chain, and ship owners and exporters around the 15 to 20% level. And then you've got the remaining participants in the value chain, port admin all the way through to onboard staff, taking a far smaller slice of the value chain. However, when you look at what's reported by these participants as their reliance on live export, the situation changes. Now, it needs to be noted that the measure of reliance was taken from a survey of northern WA participants in the value chain. So the green part is just a northern specific focus of reliance. But what it does really show is that there's not many participants in the value chain along the line there, and in particular the lower level parts of the value chain that are taking that smaller clip of the overall cost. They are taking a small proportion, but their reliance in terms of how much revenue they receive is a significant part. So if you take, for argument's sake, port admin or agents or transport operators in the northern parts of WA, they take a small part of the value chain, but their overall revenues are around 65% derived from live cattle exports. If you contrast that to quarantine and insurance operators, they take a very small part of their value chain, and also their reliance of their total revenues on live exports is quite small, at less than 5%. But you've got veterinarians, wharf operators, stevedores taking around 65% of their total revenues are based on live export trade. Fodder suppliers in the north, somewhere to 30 to 40% of their total revenues attributable to live export trade, and then obviously the live core and onboard staff, 100% of their revenues are attributable to live exports. Now, looking at it from a nominal price perspective, on the right-hand side chart shows a similar type graphic to the left, but in a different way. So we've got a cumulative total of value chain. Now, the participants that are on the smaller part of the percentage of the value chain, I've had to expand that chart within the original chart so you can see how they're identified there along the chain. And what's interesting about this chart is that the size of the bubble represents how reliant each part of the value chain are on live exports. And this clearly shows that pretty much all the way along the value chain, even down the lower end of the chain, when you're looking at onboard staff and live core and stevedores and wharf operators down the very bottom of that chain, they're taking a very small cut, but their total revenues are between 40, 50% through to 100% of their revenues are attributable to live exports. And it's really only the quarantine and insurance part of the value chain where you see those very small dots or small bubbles in the light and dark blue, and that denotes that their total revenues are less than 5% that are attributable to the live cattle export trade. So any disruption to that live cattle export trade, particularly for the northern sectors, would have a flow-on effect to quite a lot of members across the value chain, and that would be something to take into account, that the economic disruption that would happen if there was any significant concerns around the continuation of live cattle trade. It would have a flow-on effect to many participants, particularly in the north. So that pretty much finishes our webinar 2. In webinar 3, we'll take a look at a case study, particularly on the Northern Territory, and we'll focus in on regional employment levels and also climatic factors that are something that we need to take into account with regards to how important the live cattle trade is to the Northern Territory. Thanks for joining us.